Alicia shifted in her seat, trying to calm the restless movement of her toddler, who clutched a small stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. The restaurant buzzed with the hum of conversations, clattering dishes, and the occasional laughter from a nearby table, but Alicia barely noticed her mind was racing. She kept glancing around, pretending to look at her phone while the napkin in her hand bore a message no one could see at first glance. Her heart pounded like a drum she had never felt. Fear like this before. It was different from the normal anxiety of balancing bills and diaper changes. It was something darker, something urgent. She thought about her ex, who had disappeared without a trace, leaving nothing but unpaid bills and threats. Alicia had always known the world could be cruel, but tonight it felt like the cruelty was circling closer and closer. Her fingers tightened around the pen, and she scribbled another line. Just in case someone missed the first, she scanned the restaurant, slowly, her eyes darting from the door to the corners where shadows gathered, and then back to the booth across from her, where two men sat in black jackets. Their presence felt heavy, like a storm cloud looming. She could not see their faces clearly, but something about the way they moved and whispered to each other made her stomach twist with dread and hope at the same time. Her toddler hummed a tune softly, oblivious to the tension that hung in the air. Alicia forced a smile and said everything is fine to the child, but inside she was frantically calculating every possibility. She wondered if the men in the jackets had noticed the message, if they would act, if they even understood. She imagined running out into the night with the child in her arms, but the street outside looked too dark to empty, and the thought of being caught sent shivers down her spine. She had to trust that someone would see her plate. Waitress approached, bringing water and a forced smile. Alicia thanked her, trying to sound normal, her voice too steady compared to the chaos of thoughts inside. She considered leaving the napkin on the table, but then remembered the stories she had heard of people being watched, of strangers who sensed trouble and acted quickly. It was a dangerous gamble, but the napkin needed to stay visible enough to be noticed without drawing attention to herself. She folded it carefully, slipping it under the edge of the menu so that only someone paying close attention might see across the room. The men whispered again, their glances flicking toward her booth for a moment too long to be coincidence. Alicia felt a mixture of fear and relief. She was not imagining it. Someone had indeed seen the hidden message. She tried to calm her racing mind, telling herself to act normal, to keep the child entertained with small games and stories from her day at work. The boy laughed at a silly sound she made, and for a moment Alicia felt a tiny spark of hope that life might continue as usual, that they might get through this night safely. Her phone buzzed on the table, a notification she ignored, pretending to read a message that was not there. Every instinct in her body screamed to move to the door, to leave, to run, but she stayed seated, trying to appear casual as the shadows around her seemed to grow longer. She could hear the faint scrape of shoes against the floorboards of the restaurant as the men adjusted their positions. She could not see their faces, but the way they leaned slightly toward each other, whispered silently of a plan forming. Alicia tightened her grip on the napkin hidden beneath the menu, feeling the rough paper against her fingers like a lifeline. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The hum of the restaurant became a background beat to her panic and anticipation. She thought about the tiny apartment they would return to tonight, the bills stacked on the counter, the unanswered phone calls, and the sense of isolation that had followed her for months. All of that seemed to shrink in comparison to the unknown force watching from across the room. She had never been involved with anyone like these men, nor did she know how far they would go to help or harm, but her desperation had stripped her of fear enough to reach out. The toddler yawned, and Alicia smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from his face and whispering that everything was going to be okay. Even if she did not fully believe it herself, she could see the men rising slowly, slipping their coats on the backs of their chairs and moving toward the exit. The tension in her chest tightened. She wanted to follow them in case they left without noticing the message, but she also feared making a mistake. She watched as they paused near the doorway, their eyes scanning the restaurant. One glance landed on her booth, and a nod was Delicious felt a shiver run down her spine and a tiny spark of hope ignite. Her hands shook as she gently pushed the menu forward to make sure the napkin was visible. She whispered softly to her child to stay seated, to be brave, and tried to steady her own breathing as the men disappeared out the door into the dark night. Beyond the glass of the window, she could see nothing but shadows and streetlights, and yet she sensed the invisible thread that now connected her to the strangers had begun to move. She did not know what would happen next, or if they would find her again, but for the first time in weeks she felt a small glimmer that someone was listening. Her mind raced with scenarios, plans, and contingencies as she paid the bill, trying to act normal while internally counting the seconds until she could leave. She tucked the napkin carefully into her bag as if it were a talisman and stepped out into the night air, her toddler clutching her hand tightly. The city seemed larger, darker, and more dangerous than before. Every shadow a possible threat, but also every shadow a possible protector. She glanced over her shoulder, hoping to catch a glimpse of the men, but the street was empty and silent, and yet she knew they were out there watching, waiting, tracking her, and the hidden SOS had been heard. Alicia walked quickly down the street, her toddler clutching her hand tightly as the city lights flickered and shadows stretched across the pavement. She could feel the weight of every step, as if the darkness itself was pressing against her back. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to disappear, but she forced herself to stay calm, her mind spinning with what could happen next. The men from the restaurant had vanished into the night, but she knew they were there, watching, waiting, tracking her movements, and she could not tell if they were friend or foe. Their stroller wheels rattled against the uneven sidewalk, and her mind flicked to every danger she had faced before, from unpaid bills to threatening phone calls, but nothing had felt like this. Nothing had felt like someone unknown. Yet aware of her desperation, Alicia ducked into an alley, hoping to take a shortcut past a row of dimly lit stores. She clutched her bag against her chest and peeked over her shoulder every few steps, imagining the leather jackets appearing. From the shadows, she could hear distant car horns, the faint murmur of voices, but no footsteps behind her. Yet she could not shake the feeling that the world had narrowed to the small bubble around her. And her child. She remembered the napkin hidden under the menu and the careful way she had positioned it so that someone would notice it. She wondered if it had been enough, if the message had reached the right people, or if she had misjudged the signs. The alley opened onto a wider street, and Alicia slowed her pace, trying to appear casual, weaving through pedestrians and pretending to check her phone as she scanned every passerby for a glimpse of the men. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest, and every nerve in her body was on high alert. Suddenly she heard a low voice behind her, a growl almost, and she turned quickly, just in time to see a shadow detach itself from the darkness. One of the men from the restaurant stepped forward, his leather jacket gleaming under the streetlight, his eyes hidden beneath a brimmed cap. Alicia froze, unable to speak, but knowing instinctively that this was the moment she had been waiting for. He spoke softly, telling her to stay calm, to move slowly, and that she was not alone. The words were simple but carried a weight that made her knees weak. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath, and nodded, gripping her child closer. The man led her down side streets, through corridors of darkened buildings, their movements silent and deliberate. Alicia tried to follow every instruction, every subtle cue, as if her life depended on it, and in a way, it did. She could sense another presence behind them, a second man watching, covering their rear. She realized that they were not just tracking her, they were protecting her, guiding her through the urban maze that had suddenly become a battlefield of unseen threats. Her mind raced with questions. Who were these men? What did they want? Why had they noticed her distress and chosen to act? She remembered the hopeless nights spent alone in the apartment, the missed calls, the unpaid bills, the sense of helplessness that had consumed her, and wondered if this intervention could truly change anything, or if it was simply another danger disguised as salvation. They arrived at a parked car hidden beneath the shadows of a large building, and the first man gestured for her to enter. Alicia lifted her child gently and slid into the back seat, her heart still racing as the engine started, and they drove off into the dark city streets. The noise of traffic seemed distant as the car moved with purpose, and she realized that, for the first time in weeks, she felt the tiniest flicker of hope, that someone had heard her SOS, that someone had seen her desperation and had chosen to act. The city passed in a blur outside, the window shadows of buildings flashing by, streetlights reflecting in her tired eyes, and she clutched her child, whispering reassurances.